The sky over Western Europe in the summer of 1940 was a furnace of fear. Below, cities trembled under the relentless hum of Luftwaffe bombers diving, their engines slicing through the early morning mist. Above, the RAF fighters danced with death, black silhouettes darting against the pale blue. Yet amid the chaos, a quiet, invisible battle was being waged. A battle of minds, deception, and cunning. It was not the roar of guns or the flash of flak that would tilt the balance, but a simple, almost laughably low, tech trick that Allied forces employed, and for months, German intelligence, with all its sophistication, could not stop it. Consider the human mind under stress. Imagine a German intelligence officer in Berlin, hunched over maps dotted with Allied movements, desperately trying to anticipate the next RAF sortie. Reports arrive, conflicting, sometimes false, often frustratingly incomplete. Every decision carries the weight of thousands of lives. Every misstep could cost hundreds of aircraft and pilots. The Allies knew this psychological pressure well, and they exploited it with a subtle brilliance that relied not on brute force, but on deception, illusion, and patience. In the early years of the war, diving, the Luftwaffe believed that the skies were their domain. Their reconnaissance networks were extensive, their signals intelligence highly developed, and their confidence seemingly unshakable. The Germans had invested heavily in radio direction, finding stations, radar-like devices such as Freya and WWII, and a complex system of signal encryption. They relied on meticulously trained operators to track every aircraft that crossed occupied Europe. Yet even with all this technology and expertise, the Allies found a way to slip past them, not with stealth aircraft or secret codes, but with a tactic so simple it seemed almost absurd in retrospect. The story begins with the night skies over Britain. The Blitz had begun. London, Coventry, Birmingham, and other industrial centres endured relentless bombing. The RAF was stretched thin, pilots operating on nerves frayed by exhaustion and fear. Yet, in laboratories, workshops, and airfields far from the front lines, scientists and engineers were devising a strategy that would turn the Luftwaffe's confidence into confusion. They were experimenting with electronic countermeasures, dummy signals, and decoys that mimicked real aircraft. Every test, every trial, was carefully documented. RAF engineers noting which frequencies provoked German radar operators, how long it took for them to respond, and which signals could be repeated without revealing the deception. Behavioral psychology played a role, whether the scientists realized it at the time or not. They understood, intuitively, that the Germans would react predictably to what appeared to be real threats. When radar blips multiplied in certain patterns, Luftwaffe controllers assumed they were seeing squadrons of bombers preparing an attack. When no bombers arrived at the expected locations, they adjusted their calculations, but the Allies had anticipated this too. Each misstep by the enemy became a tool, a feedback loop, feeding the next phase of deception. One of the most striking aspects of this campaign was its audacity. Pilots reported the first instances of what would later be known as window. In early trials, strips of thin metal foil, cut to precise lengths, released from aircraft would scatter and reflect German radar signals. To a radar operator, the sky suddenly filled with phantom formations, hundreds of bombers where there were only a handful. Imagine sitting in a darkened operations room, the faint hum of machinery and the scratch of pencil on graph paper, convinced that a massive raid was imminent, only to realize hours later that nothing had materialized. The confusion was disorienting, even terrifying, and the Germans had no immediate solution. German intelligence officers began questioning their own reports. Signals were inconsistent. Radar readings seemed unreliable. Reconnaissance flights could not verify the phantom squadrons. The Allies had found a psychological wedge and driven it deep. It was a battle of perception as much as of metal and gunpowder. And, in that vacuum of certainty, mistakes multiplied. Luftwaffe pilots were scrambled to intercept raids that didn't exist. Anti-aircraft batteries fired at invisible targets. The real bombers, fewer in number, slipped through the chaos with dramatically increased chances of survival. Even more remarkable was the Allies' meticulous record keeping. Every deployment of foil strips was catalogued. Every flight pattern, every radar reflection was analyzed and refined. Wartime documents preserved in the RAF archives reveal the level of scientific rigor applied. One report notes, almost clinically, that strips of 27 centimeters caused maximum signal disruption at a particular Freya station. Another document details an experiment where multiple waves of foil clouds were dropped sequentially, creating the illusion of an approaching armada over 3 separate towns. The Germans, relying on the same technology to anticipate attacks, were forced into a reactive, almost paralyzed state. At the human level, the stakes could not have been higher. RAF pilots knew that any failure could mean capture, imprisonment, or death. Yet they also understood that these small acts of deception were as vital as any dogfight in the skies. Every ounce of metal dropped, every fabricated signal sent, was a calculated risk with real consequences. Memoirs from bomber crews recount the strange mixture of fear and exhilaration as they released foil strips over occupied Europe. Knowing that the Germans were chasing ghosts while the real bombers pressed on to targets. The ingenuity of the tactic lies in its elegance. It required no secret weapon, no revolutionary aircraft, just an understanding of enemy psychology, precision in execution, and patience. It was simple, yet devastatingly effective. And for months, despite all their technological advantage and trained minds, the Germans could not identify the method, let alone counter it. The delay in their understanding would shape the air war over Europe in ways that are still studied by military historians today. As the story unfolds, we will trace the development of this deceptively simple trick from its experimental beginnings to its full-scale implementation, revealing how ordinary men and women, scientists, engineers, and pilots, brought the weight of German intelligence to its knees. We will hear from those who lived it, whose memoirs and after-action reports illuminate the tension, fear, and courage that defined this period. We will uncover the small moments of human ingenuity that, in aggregate, changed the course of the air war. And yet, as brilliant as the tactic was, it carried enormous risks. One miscalculation could have led to disaster, a single misstep exposing the ruse and costing hundreds of lives. The suspense, the uncertainty, diving, and the courage of those involved provide a window into the psychological dimensions of warfare that are rarely captured in conventional histories. In the quiet, diving, glowing control rooms of the RAF, amid the roar of engines and the distant sound of anti-aircraft fire, history was being written not just in bombs and bullets, but in cunning, calculation, and courage. The question remains, how could a strategy so simple, so reliant on human perception and deception, evade the scrutiny of one of the most advanced intelligence networks of the era? The answer lies at the intersection of psychology, technology, and human error. a combination that would haunt the Luftwaffe for months to come. And it is a story that begins, as all great stories do, with a single spark of ingenuity, and the willingness to test it against the full might of the enemy. The night over the North Sea was black as ink, pierced only by the occasional flicker of searchlights sweeping the horizon like skeletal fingers. RAF Bomber Command crews climbed into their aircraft, pre-flight checks completed under the shivering chill of the winter air. Each pilot and navigator knew the mission ahead was fraught with danger. Not only did they face flak and enemy fighters, but they also carried a secret that, if discovered, could change the course of the air war. What they were about to release was not bombs, but a weapon of illusion. Metal strips known simply as window. The concept was deceptively straightforward. Small pieces of aluminum cut to precise lengths, released from the wings of bombers at altitude, would reflect German radar waves. To Luftwaffe operators, a small squadron of aircraft suddenly appeared to be a massive formation, a phantom fleet moving across the sky. Yet the genius of the tactic lay in its subtlety. RAF scientists had studied German radar meticulously, analyzing wavelength, reflection, and atmospheric interference. Each strip had to be calculated to create maximum disruption without alerting the operators to the deception. Too short, and the radar ignored it. Too long, and the signal became suspiciously irregular. The first operational test occurred during the winter of 1943 over the industrial heartlands of Germany. Early in the morning, as frost hung in the fields and rooftops, bomber crews released the first loads of window. Operators at German Freya and WWII stations reported large incoming formations, hundreds of bombers streaming toward key industrial targets. Alarm bells rang, flak batteries scrambled, night fighters vectored into the path of the imaginary squadrons. But when the bombs fell hours later, it became evident that no such massed formation had existed. Only a handful of actual bombers had crossed the border, having flown largely unmolested through the confusion they had created. This was a turning point. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence reveal the disorientation the tactic caused. Radar operators, trained to respond to numerical and positional data with precision, found themselves chasing shadows. Pilots, instructed to intercept specific formations, often engaged nothing more than scattered strips of foil glinting in searchlights. Conflicting accounts emerged in German communications. Some officers suspected sabotage or equipment malfunction, while others feared that the RAF had somehow cracked the codes of German radar. Now, the truth, that a simple metallic foil could render advanced radar almost useless, was too incredible to grasp at first. RAF operational records show that following each mission, intelligence officers and scientists painstakingly recorded every variable: altitude, release timing, strip length, weather conditions, and aircraft formation. Memoirs from bomber navigators emphasize the strange mixture of tension and exhilaration as they executed these maneuvers. Flying through anti-aircraft fire, navigating in blackout conditions over enemy territory, and then releasing a payload whose only weapon was deception required nerves of steel. One navigator recalled the eerie silence inside the aircraft after release, the strips drifting downward like silver snowflakes, knowing that unseen enemy eyes were tracing illusions in the sky. The Germans were methodical in their attempts to counter the tactic. Luftwaffe technical journals describe repeated tests to distinguish real aircraft from phantom echoes, including comparing radar data with reconnaissance photos and fighter reports. Yet each measure fell short. The radar operators had no method to identify which echoes were genuine, and the Luftwaffe's command structure, constrained by rigid hierarchy and slow communication, was ill-equipped to adapt in real time. Window exploited not just technology, but the human limitations of perception and decision-making. There were also operational innovations that made the deception even more effective. RAF crews began synchronizing window releases with timing and navigation that mimicked real raid patterns. They employed formations of bombers to appear as multiple waves of attacks, creating the illusion of relentless pressure on German defenses. In some instances, diversions were staged hundreds of kilometers away, drawing fighters and flak away from the actual targets. German pilots described the frustration of chasing phantom raids, fuel burning while no tangible target appeared. Every hour spent in pursuit of ghosts was an hour during which Allied bombers completed their missions with minimal interference. What makes this story even more remarkable is the ingenuity of those who devised it under wartime constraints. Aluminum was a critical resource, heavily rationed for aircraft production. Yet planners recognized that the cost of these small strips was negligible compared to the lives saved and targets protected. The human factor was equally critical. Pilots had to release the strips at precise altitudes and intervals to maximize effect, and any deviation could reduce the illusion. Yet, through careful training, strict operational discipline, and meticulous planning, the tactic worked repeatedly. The result was a blend of science, psychology, and human courage that remains a textbook example of wartime innovation. Some accounts from German intelligence officers preserved in post-war interrogations convey the exasperation felt in the face of repeated failure. Radar operators were pressured for explanations, commanders demanded immediate solutions, and analysts examined mountains of data for anomalies. Every hypothesis, equipment malfunction, weather interference, secret Allied technology, was considered, but none accounted fully for the phenomenon. It was a textbook case of cognitive overload faced with an unexpected and inexplicable situation. Human decision-making faltered. The Allies exploited that human weakness as deliberately as they did the radar itself. Memoirs from RAF bomber crews often highlight a paradoxical sense of empowerment. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, facing death daily, yet entrusted with a weapon that required neither explosive ordnance nor dogfighting skill to be deadly in effect. Each sortie, diving, each release of window, was an act of quiet cunning that subverted the enemy's technological advantage. The air war was no longer just a contest of machines and numbers. It had become a battle of perception, strategy, and imagination. The results were tangible. In subsequent raids, bomber losses decreased dramatically. German fighter responses were slower, anti-aircraft fire less effective, and the Luftwaffe's overall morale began to erode under the strain of repeated miscalculations. RAF command documents confirm that the use of window saved countless lives and ensured that critical targets were bombed with greater accuracy. Yet the psychological effect on both sides was profound. The Allies gained confidence in their ingenuity, while the Germans were forced into constant doubt, uncertainty, and reactive planning. Even as the Allies perfected the tactic, they remained mindful of the risks. If the Germans had discovered the method, its effectiveness would have vanished instantly. Therefore, every operation was conducted with secrecy, and the knowledge of the technique was tightly controlled. Only a select few knew the full details. The majority of aircrew were briefed just enough to perform their tasks. The combination of operational security, scientific precision, and human discipline made the tactic both lethal and sustainable. In hindsight, diving. The brilliance of Window lies not in the complexity of its design, but in the simplicity of its execution and its profound psychological effect on the enemy. It was a subtle form of warfare that undermined the Luftwaffe's confidence and forced them to confront a reality they could not control. And it was executed by ordinary men and women whose courage, intellect, and discipline turned a simple foil strip into a weapon more powerful than many bombs dropped during the war. The stage was set for the final, decisive phase, diving. With the Germans still baffled, Allied planners could expand their use of deception to shape the air war on a strategic scale. The next step would test both the limits of human ingenuity and the resilience of the men who had been entrusted with a weapon of shadows. And it was here, in the culmination of months of careful experimentation and psychological mastery, that the story reaches its most dramatic and revealing moments that would not only confound the Luftwaffe, but redefine the very nature of aerial warfare. By the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe's confidence in their radar systems had begun to crack. Months of operations had produced a pattern that German intelligence could not explain. Night after night, reports of incoming formations flooded the operations rooms. Sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of aircraft, but reconnaissance flights and fighter sweeps revealed nothing. Pilots returned from interceptions bewildered, reporting ghostly flak bursts in empty skies or radar contacts that vanished without warning. The Allies had created a psychological fog, one that could paralyze the most confident command structure and render advanced technology almost useless. In RAF briefing rooms, the mood was tense but quietly triumphant. Mission planners knew that the Luftwaffe's inability to respond effectively was as valuable as the bombing itself. Each sortie carried dual objectives: strike the target and manipulate enemy perception. Pilots and navigators were briefed with precision, instructed on exact altitudes, release points, and timing for deploying Window. Even small errors could compromise the illusion, so meticulous care was essential. In many cases, crews flew into flak-saturated zones with their own lives at risk, yet the strips they released caused no physical destruction, only deception, a lethal psychological strike that would ripple through enemy defenses. The human element was critical. Luftwaffe radar operators, accustomed to interpreting static blips as real aircraft, were increasingly uncertain. Memoirs and post-war interrogations reveal frustration bordering on panic. Some officers suspected sabotage, others feared that new Allied technology had rendered their equipment obsolete. The uncertainty created hesitation, and hesitation in war is deadly. German night fighter pilots were vectored to phantom formations, burning fuel and exposing themselves to anti-aircraft fire, while real bombers passed safely toward their objectives. Every sortie became a lesson in the limits of perception under stress. One of the most audacious applications of Window occurred during the massive raids on Hamburg in July 1943. Operation Gomorrah, as it was called, involved hundreds of bombers, both heavy and medium, in waves designed to overwhelm German defenses. Window was deployed to create phantom formations well ahead of the main force. German radar stations reported multiple large-scale incursions. Night fighters scrambled repeatedly, chasing ghosts across the sky. Observers on the ground reported flashes of flak that seemed to converge on invisible aircraft. Actual bomber losses were dramatically reduced compared to earlier raids of similar scale, and the chaos caused by phantom formations magnified the psychological impact. It was not just the physical damage that mattered. It was the erosion of confidence, the invisible attrition of morale. The Luftwaffe attempted countermeasures. They experimented with filtering radar signals, relying on visual confirmation, and cross-referencing reports from multiple stations. Yet these measures proved insufficient. Even when multiple intelligence channels were used, phantom formations persisted. The Germans were facing a cunning adversary who had anticipated both their technology and their psychology. Every adaptation by the enemy was met with an innovative tweak by RAF planners. This cat and mouse game stretched German analytical capacity to its limits and left them chronically reactive. The psychological dimension of the deception cannot be overstated. Pilots and radar operators are trained to rely on certainty. When that certainty is undermined, fear and doubt creep in. German records from the period show growing anxiety in command reports, confusion in communication logs, and repeated miscalculations that cost aircraft and pilots. The Allies understood that war is fought as much in the mind as in the air, and Window exploited that truth with precision. It was a weapon that targeted nerves, judgment, and perception. For the men releasing the foil strips, there was an odd blend of satisfaction and tension. RAF memoirs describe the eerie calm after the release. The strips, glinting like silver snowflakes in the moonlight, drifting silently downward, a subtle but potent promise of misdirection. Each crew member understood that while the enemy was chasing illusions, the real bombers were completing their missions. It was a form of silent heroism, risk without spectacle, courage without recognition, yet immensely consequential. The tactic demanded discipline, precision, and trust in human ingenuity over brute force. Historians today note that the use of Window marked a paradigm shift in air warfare. It demonstrated that even the most advanced technology could be rendered ineffective by clever, low-cost countermeasures. It showed that human psychology, anticipation, and deception were as vital as speed, armor, or firepower. The tactic was a lesson in the interplay between perception and reality, one that would influence electronic warfare for decades to come. RAF post-war horror analyses credit Window with saving thousands of aircrew lives and significantly reducing bomber losses while maintaining operational effectiveness against heavily defended targets. Eventually, German intelligence pieced together the method, but not before it had altered the dynamics of the air war. The delay, months of uncertainty and misinterpretation, gave the Allies strategic leverage, enabling sustained bombing campaigns with reduced losses. Reports from captured officers and post-war interrogations describe the incredulity and frustration at realizing that a simple, low-tech innovation had so effectively confounded one of the most advanced military apparatuses of the era. The Luftwaffe, for all its sophistication, had underestimated the ingenuity and adaptability of its enemy. As we reflect on these events, the broader human story emerges. Ordinary men and women, under extreme pressure, applied intellect, courage, and imagination to a problem that seemed insurmountable. Engineers in laboratories, pilots in freezing cockpits, navigators charting courses by moonlight, all contributed to a tapestry of innovation that relied on precision, discipline, and the understanding of human psychology. The consequences were immediate and profound. The Luftwaffe misallocated resources, the RAF reduced casualties. and strategic bombing campaigns achieved results that might otherwise have been impossible. The saga of Window reminds us that warfare is never solely about technology or numbers. It is about human perception, decision-making, and the subtle interplay of fear, expectation, and ingenuity. A simple strip of aluminum, cut to the exact dimensions needed to create an illusion, became more powerful than fleets of aircraft, more decisive than firepower alone. It illustrates that even in the midst of destruction and death, creativity and courage can tilt the scales. In the end, the story closes not with a dramatic dogfight or a single heroic act, but with a quiet, enduring triumph of human ingenuity. The Luftwaffe, confident and technologically advanced, was confounded not by new aircraft or bombs, but by an understanding of its own limitations, and by the Allies' willingness to exploit them. For months, a simple trick had worked flawlessly, and it shaped the air war over Europe in ways visible, verbal, and invisible. As night fell over the ruins of Hamburg, over the fields of the North Sea, and across the industrial heartlands, those phantom formations continued their silent work. In the minds of the enemy, the skies were crowded, chaotic, and uncertain. In reality, the air was open, and the bombers pressed on to their objectives, guided by courage, ingenuity, and a quiet faith in a tactic that was as simple as it was brilliant. It is a lesson that resonates beyond the war. That clarity, cunning, and courage can transform even the most straightforward idea into a force capable of changing history. And so the deception endured, not in the roar of engines or the flash of flak, but in the invisible currents of thought, perception, and fear. It was a victory born of intellect and subtlety, and it stands today as one of the most remarkable examples of strategy, psychology, and courage in modern warfare.